Hi, everyone. I am happy to be here, and I call my talk The Accidental Fiber Artist because I had no idea that this would be my path in life. So come along with me on my journey from forest to fiber. Whatever creative talent I have, I think genetically originated with my grandmother, my maternal grandmother, Ethel Brooks. She was a very prolific painter, both oils and watercolors. My grandparents lived in Plattsmouth, Nebraska, south of Omaha, and they had a very rustic cabin on Battle Lake, Minnesota. And we would go there for a couple of weeks every summer. My grandmother had her easel set up in the dining area, and it had windows on three sides, and she would sit there and paint hour after hour, and I was just fascinated watching her. But one regret I have is that I never asked her to teach me. As long as I can remember, I've dabbled with making things. And I probably started with mud pies because of the kids my age in the neighborhood where I grew up. I was the only girl. So lots of mud pies, lots of scraped knees and getting dirty and doing those sorts of things. This relic is my very first fiber piece. It was unearthed from an archaeological dig in my mother's attic and carbon dated to about 1962. Around age 9, I was given one of these frame looms and made a lot of pot holders, dozens and dozens of pot holders, and they went to friends and relatives, and my mom had a stack of them, which she used for decades, and they were indestructible. It was amazing. They just lasted and lasted. They didn't even become frayed. And I think hundreds of years from now, archaeologists might dig these things up and wonder what in the world they were. My last art class was 8th grade, and it was taught by Bernice Johnson. Everyone knew her as Miss J, and Miss J was something of a tyrant. It was very hard to please her. And the only thing I remember about that art class was at one point we had an assignment to replicate a Gothic style alphabet on large square graph paper. And I had to do my entire assignment over because I went outside the lines. And frankly, I've been going outside the lines ever since. In high school, I was given an Inkle loom, and this was a little more sophisticated than the loopy pot holder frame loom. And I made a lot of belts. These were hippie years, and I really wasn't a hippie, but I sold several belts to friends and high school colleagues. So it was a fun time. I learned a little bit more about weaving. During this time, I went to a summer camp in Colorado, and most of the activities were hiking or backpacking, many of which took place in Rocky Mountain National Park. And that was where I realized that I wanted to be a national park ranger. So off I went to Colorado State University and enrolled in the School of Forestry. Little did I know at the time that CSU had a very highly regarded fiber program in the arts department. I had no idea at all. And during the time I lived in Fort Collins, I think that Hand Weavers Guild of America had one of their convergence conferences there. But again, I had no clue. Most of my curriculum was natural sciences, such as geology, dendrology, ornithology, and a lot of other ologies, and soils. I hated the soils class. It was mostly all chemistry, and I couldn't for the life of me figure out how someone would want to spend their entire life's works studying dirt. But I reached my goal, and I became a national park ranger. I worked one summer in Rocky Mountain National Park, and then an internship and 2 summers in Great Smoky Mountains National Park. On this particular day, I was working in one of the campgrounds, and this young man caught this sizable fish, and the park photographer was there and wanted yours truly in a publicity photo. So there I am in my Smokey Bear hat. This summer I worked in Roosevelt National Forest outside of Fort Collins, and I patrolled campgrounds every day in an area called Poudre Canyon, and I drove 120 miles every day checking on the campgrounds, but I was also on call for forest fires, and fortunately there were no huge ones that summer, but I was called to 3, went into one by helicopter, so that was exciting. And it was very arduous and dirty work, but satisfying. The 3 fires I went to were caused by lightning strikes, and so they weren't large, and fortunately we were able to get them under control rather quickly. But if I was late getting back to the office, my husband would look out to the west from where we lived, and if he saw smoke, he knew I'd be late for dinner. And you can't imagine what I smelled like when I got home. After that summer, we were on the move due to my husband's Army career, and we lived several places, including 2 tours in Germany, one of which was Berlin, and we were there when the wall opened. So we saw all of that, and it was really exciting. One stop along the way in all these moves was Fort Bliss, Texas, which is part of El Paso. And my husband attended a school there for only 6 months, so I decided I was going to play for 6 months. I didn't try to find a job. And the Army craft shop there offered weaving and pottery classes. And these are 2 things I always wanted to learn how to do. So I signed up for both. For the pottery class, I had to buy 8 pounds of clay. And by the time I got done demolishing 8 pounds of clay, I had these little bells to show for my effort, and I knew I would not be a potter. So I admire potters and their work tremendously to this day, and I do have a large collection of pottery. But the weaving stuck. We moved to Salem, Oregon the first time, and I took more weaving classes from the Salem Art Association. And at one point, my teacher suggested that I undertake the Hand Weavers Guild of America's Certificate of Excellence in Hand Weaving. The first part of it required weaving 40 samples of 40 different weaving techniques. Most of them I had never done before, so I had to teach myself, and I had to make them as perfect as possible because they were going to be judged to see if I was worthy of the certificate. So this one was the inlay techniques. These are about 7 by 10 inches. Looped and cut pile techniques. Again, it's a little more, probably 11 inches long, about 7 inches wide. And this was a rug technique, which I loved, but I used rather small wool fiber to weave this, so it would be more in scale with the size of the sample, again, 7 by 10 inches. I thought at one point I would be a rug weaver. It didn't work out that way, but I still fantasize about weaving a boundary weave rug someday because I love the beautiful designs that you can come up with. For the master level, the first level took me 2 years. The master level took another 2 years. And actually, it's a thesis, though they don't call it that. It's an in-depth study where we had to choose a topic, do research, produce samples that was suggested by the research, and that culminated in weaving 3 to 5 major pieces. And this is a detail of one of my major pieces. My subject matter was supplementary warp, or weaving with more than one warp, which I use for patterning effects. So it took 4 years. I feel like I have an MFA in weaving, but it's not accredited, unfortunately. So there we are. Now, I'll digress for a moment. I love puzzles. I love difficult crossword puzzles. I love difficult Sudoku puzzles, and I love jigsaw puzzles. They have to be at least 1,000 pieces. And they're addictive. So I only allow myself to do one once a year between Christmas and New Year's. So this was my annual puzzle one year. For me, weaving, one of the reasons I love weaving is because, in a way, it's puzzle solving. I have to figure out how to make each thread do what I want it to do in order to achieve the cloth that I have in mind. So it fits right in with my love of puzzles. This was one piece, a scarf in one of my, what I called my opera series. Again, it's woven with 2 warps. It's all silk. These are meant to be tuxedo scarves, and they were inspired by a time when we lived in Berlin. We went to an opera in East Berlin in their opera house, which it was still East Berlin at the time, so it was still kind of shabby. The upkeeping hadn't been what was needed, but it was one of those traditional old, really ornate opera houses. And we went to a production of Die Fledermaus. And one of the scenes was this grand ballroom scene, and all the women were wearing these fabulous gowns, and the men were all in tuxedos. They were all wearing tuxedo scarves. One of the lead singers had a very exaggerated long scarf, and he tripped over the end of it to the howling delight of the audience. And I've never forgotten that. So that sort of inspired me to weave tuxedo scarves. This is a detail of the previous one. As much as I enjoy the elegance of those all white scarves, I also love working with color, but I'm not a dyer. I took a dyeing class many years ago. I didn't really enjoy it. It was messy. I don't have a good place at home to do any dyeing. So I have to rely on other methods to try and achieve color blending or color movement in my pieces. In this particular one, the background warp, the foundation warp, we call it a ground warp, which is the purple to red to orange. Each thread actually is 2 rayon sewing threads that are doubled. So I can change one thread, one color at a time in the pair as I move across the warp to get a little more. So I don't have really drastic color changes where they occur. It's more of a blending appearance, all because I don't do any dyeing. In this piece, I've used the doubled rayon sewing thread to form those orange lines that are on both sides of the scarf. Here, it's all silk, so in order to not have stark changes, color changes in the background, I would first change to the second color, then I'd change back to the first color, then I'd change to the second color again and back and forth, maybe for a couple threads at a time, to get that more fuzzy blended appearance rather than a stark change from the 2 colors. Sometime around 1998 or 99, I was introduced to ply splitting. And ply splitting, more formally known as ply split braiding, is a technique that's indigenous to the Rajasthan area of Northwest India. And there the practitioners are all men, and they make their cords out of goat hair. And they make bands and girths and bags and ceremonial accoutrements for camels. So that's the traditional basis for ply splitting. It's my portable technique. I've tried to learn to knit 3 times. It never stuck. I do crochet, but not much at all. So I ply split. It's my portable technique. I can take it anywhere. And I use this tool called a grip fid. And I have to make it, you're splitting 4-ply cords, and I have to make all the cords myself. So the pointy end of the grip fid splits a 4-ply cord. So 2 plies are on top and 2 plies are underneath. And then another cord goes in the slot and you pull it through. And you can split several cords in succession and pull one cord through all the cords at once. And the resulting pieces you get are dense and durable, and they lend themselves to sculptural effects because they are somewhat malleable. This is one of my 2 pieces that were selected for Lark Book's 500 baskets. All these cords, again, I made them myself. They're all linen, bleached and unbleached linen. This is about 12 inches across, including the tassels on the end, the little cords. This is my second piece in 500 baskets. It's about 7.5 inches tall. And this was my first foray into mixed media, mixed fiber media. These 2 pieces were split exactly the same. They're the same size. About the main ply splitting is about 3.5 inches across, and they both have little ball button feet. One of the pieces was made with all silk cords and one with rough linen cords, and I think you can tell the difference. I kept thinking about how I might combine ply splitting and weaving, and for a while I made some of these scarf and necklace sets. Both of these scarves are woven with supplementary warps, 2 warps, and the cords for the ply splitting are the same silk that was used in the scarves. The one on the right was in an NWDC exhibition a few years ago in Tacoma. I love designing cords. I love working with color with the cords, and sometimes I never quite know what's going to happen. In this piece, it's about 7 inches high. I alternated a cinnamon brown colored cord with a space dyed cord. And they alternated throughout. When I made the space dyed cords, I just let the colors fall at random. Again, these are 4-ply cords, but the difference here is that 1 ply of every cord is blue. And so I didn't know what was going to happen when I did this. Here, I started at the very center here and made sure that the blue was showing. And from then on, I just waited to see what would happen. And I didn't know, but I ended up with these horizontal lines, evenly spaced of blue around the piece. And I was thrilled. I had no idea that was going to happen. So it was one of those bits of serendipity that I enjoyed. Okay, back to weaving for a moment. Those of you who are not weavers, let me introduce you to some weaving terms. This is what's known as a weaving draft, we call it. And this part here is how we thread the loom. Each one of those numbers represents 1 thread, 1 warp thread on the loom. This area here is called the tie-up. And this is how we tie up the treadles that we press down to create an opening in the threads. So some of the threads, individual threads, will be raised and some will remain down. And that creates an opening that we call a shed. And you pass a shuttle through the shed. The shuttle has what we call the weft on it. And then each of these is 1 depression of a separate treadle to create those shed openings. This area we call a drawdown. And it's kind of a plan that shows us how the cloth is going to be woven. It gives us a diagram or a picture of the cloth. In this case, it's what I would call an interlacement drawdown, because it shows how, instead of just coloring squares on graph paper, it shows how the threads are actually interlacing. So this is a warp thread here, a vertical warp thread. This is a horizontal weft thread. So this gives me a picture of the cloth. And before weaving programs became available to us, I would spend hours at a time doing this on graph paper, coloring in the squares to get a picture of the cloth. And if I made a mistake in doing the drawdown and I got my loom all prepared and started weaving, and then I would say, uh-oh, now what am I going to do? This isn't working out. So by doing it on a computer with a computer program, I can usually tell essentially if it's going to work or not. Maybe not exactly what it's going to look like, but how the threads interlace, and if I think it's going to be a successful weaving. So as I said, this is one thread here. This is another thread here. And I was looking at those one day and I thought, well, what if those are cords instead of threads? And the light bulb clicked on and I said, I can ply split that drawdown. So that sent my ply splitting off in a totally new direction. And it was very exciting. I did a lot of sampling. And this is the sample of that previous drawdown. And I really enjoyed doing this. It was loads of fun. I still envision someday making really larger size cords, and it'll take a lot of wool and it might burn out my cord maker and drill, but I envision doing a rug in this technique. It hasn't happened yet, but maybe someday. So that led to more ply splitting from drawdowns. For the weavers who are listening, this is a drawdown of a advancing twill. This piece was in NWDC's 60th anniversary exhibition. And it's a sort of a picture of the life cycle of the lodgepole pine tree. The lodgepole pine cones are very resinous, and they need fire. They need the heat from a fire to open and disperse their seeds. So that's the first part of the life cycle. Then germination is next. In the charred forest, the seeds germinate, and then the seedlings start to grow, and then finally you have a mature forest. So that's lodgepole cycle. This piece is derived from a design, a miniature weaving design by Bertha Gray Hayes. And one of the people listening today is Norma Smeda, one of my mentors, who founded and runs the Saunderstown Weaving School. And she and 3 others compiled all of the Bertha Gray Hayes designs into one fabulous book, which is in the library of many, many weavers. And this is one of those miniature designs. Now, if I had woven this, the horizontal and vertical threads would be straight for the most part. But when I ply split the design and I pull the cords to tighten them up, the cords start to get a little wavy looking. So that's quite a different appearance than it would be had this been woven. But it was fun to make all these discoveries when I was ply splitting from these drawdowns. That led to this book. It was supposed to be a weaving book, but it morphed into a ply splitting book because I was the only one at the time who was approaching ply splitting this way. And that led to being selected to teach at the Braids International Conference in 2012 in Manchester, England. And I had an international students. The one lady from Japan spoke very little English, but when she would get hesitant or not sure about something, I would demonstrate for her, and she picked it up right away. And from time to time, one of the other attendees from Japan who spoke good English would come in and translate for her if she wanted, but usually she didn't need it. And the lady from the Netherlands spoke perfect English. At this point, I was still wanting to find ways to combine techniques that I do. And I thought, well, I weave with supplementary warps. Why not ply split with supplementary cords? So the gold cords in this necklace are supplementary cords. They are not ply split. They move above and below the surface of the band. They are not anchored in at all by ply splitting. So that was one experiment. And here again, I was using supplementary cords moving up the sides of this piece. And they're just moving above and below. They're not ply split until I got the rim to the rim where I did start ply splitting them here. So it would be more sturdy. I also started making globe knots for decorative embellishments. And essentially these are weaving in the round. They're made around a core. So you tighten, in this case, cords. I was using cords, and you tighten them around a core. If the core wasn't there, they would collapse. But this is essentially weaving in the round. It's time consuming. It took me over 2 hours to make each of these knots. And I should say that ply splitting is also very time intensive. It takes a long time to complete a ply split piece. During a time when I had a broken hand and I couldn't weave, I couldn't ply split, I couldn't drive, which was very frustrating, I bought a beautiful used Mara die, which is a type of a Japanese braiding stand, and I started braiding. This goes beyond the usual 3-strand braid that we all learned as kids. It's more complex. In this case, the magenta is comprised of 16 cords that are braided together. But when I started braiding on the Mara die and my hand was in a cast, Japanese braiding requires very specific hand motions, and they're symmetrical, and your hands are moving at the same time in a symmetrical fashion. And I couldn't do it because one hand was in a cast, so I was literally all thumbs. But I did master a few basic braids. And then I moved on to this piece where I was combining a ply split tube, which is the turquoise, and then the magenta braid. And I braided them together in an unusual braid structure with individual cords. The ply split tube probably took 4 times as long to complete as the braid. Each of them I was using 16 cords, but the ply splitting took far longer than the braiding. This is another example of combining ply splitting and braiding. And here I'm transitioning from ply splitting to braiding and back. And that was another interesting thing to figure out. And I like the textural differences here. That's why I used only one color. So the smooth looking areas are the ply split tube, and the more nubbly looking areas are the braid. And 16 cords were used for the ply split tubes and the braid. And then I made end caps out of globe knots, and then a globe knot focal point. So this kind of work led me to being invited to teach at the International Braids Conference in Tacoma in 2016, where again, I had students from different countries. It was great fun. And the lady on the left from Japan, I I was amazed by her. Every day she showed up wearing a fabulous kimono. She was the only one. There were lots of people from Japan at the conference. She was the only one who dressed in traditional kimono every single day. She was a marvel. She spoke no English at all, but the other ladies in my class did speak English and helped her when necessary. So we had a great time. Also in 2016, I finally got my weaving book done and published. I had it printed locally because I wanted complete control over it. Printing was expensive, so through Weaving Channels, I offered a pre-order. So I offered free shipping if you pre-ordered by a certain date. And I thought, well, this might help offset some of the printing costs. Well, by golly, I got enough pre-orders to completely pay for the printing. But it also meant that once I picked up the cartons of books, I had to spend I don't know how many days packaging up about 300 books to ship. I tried to make an appointment at the post office. They wouldn't let me. So I put all the packaged books in cartons, put them on a luggage trolley, and off I went to the post office. And of course, I was standing in line. I got there right when it opened, but people were looking at me out of, from the side, wondering how long is this going to take? And when I got up to the clerk, she was very kind. She says, don't pay attention to them. She says, I'm here to help you. You're my customer, and off we'll go. So it took over 2.5 hours. From time to time, her supervisor would come out and stare at me and say, how many more do you have? And I said, well, I tried to make an appointment and I couldn't. And the lady who was helping me said, don't worry, we'll get it all done. And so, like I said, 2.5 hours, and the sales receipt was twice the length of the post office room. Another opportunity that came about at the 2012 conference in Manchester was meeting Roderick Owen. And Roderick is a world authority on braiding, and he's done a lot of studies of loop twining textiles, ancient textiles from the Paracas area of Peru. And in 2015, Roderick invited me to a braiding retreat, which he was tutoring in California. So how could I say no? And I learned this loop twining technique about the third day of the retreat. He asked if anyone wanted to learn. And so I decided to learn loop twining. I didn't like it. We were using these garish acrylic craft yarns. That's probably one of the reasons I didn't like it. But I felt it was very awkward. I really couldn't get a good rhythm going with my hands. And I had trouble making sense of it until I realized that I could ply split the design. So that was another revelation and sent me off in another direction with my ply splitting and working with these ancient Peruvian textile designs. And that led to this kind of work. These are the ultimate puzzles for me to solve. I have to start out with a narrow band, a couple inches wide, to figure out how the design works with the cords. And then from there, I go to figuring out how I can make it three-dimensional. So the cords move in the band, the cords move from side to side and back. But in 3 dimensions, they move continuously around the vessel. So it was quite a brain exercise figuring out how to get these to work. The one on the right in the back was chosen for National Basketry Association's members in print 2. And the one in the center was part of the National Basketry Organization's Every One exhibition, and it won the Labyrinthine Award for most complex. And Lanny Bergner was one of the jurors, so I was quite pleased at that. this is starting out one of these pieces, and you can see the jumble of cords. It looks like a rat's nest. Fortunately, I've never gotten them tangled so badly that I couldn't get them untangled, but usually every so often I have to pick up the piece from the bottom and shake it out and get my fingers in there to straighten out the cords. But I'm usually working with maybe 3 or 4 cords at a time as I move around the little vessel. So the rest are idle, but this particular one is taking 72 cords to complete. As I said, I've been trying to work with, over the years, I've been working with mixed media. This was probably my first major mixed media piece of a few years ago. And for the weavers, the mat that I wove is 3113 twill for the Sudoku grid. I ply split the dish for all the pieces. And then it was a scavenger hunt for all the numbers. I had to have 9 of each number. So the ones are buttons, and they're on a ply split background. The 2s are vintage French francs. I went to a coin shop here in Salem, and I told the man I was looking for 9 of a certain coin with large numbers, less than 10. And he pointed to this huge, it was probably 4 feet by 4 feet, 6-inch deep table in the middle of the room, and told me to start looking. So I started pawing through all these coins, and the first one I came up with a larger numeral, and I found 9 of was the vintage French francs. The 3s are keyboard keys. A friend took me to a really strange electronic surplus store in Denver. And again, I told the man working there, he had bins and bins and bins on rows and rows of shelving. And I said, I'm looking for keyboard keys. I need 9 of the same keyboard key. And he knew right which bin to pull out. And then my friend and I started pawing through until I got 9 of the same kind, and they were 3s. I went to the post office and I purchased 9 of every stamp less than 10 cents and ended up using the 4-cent stamps. The 5s are supplementary warp weaving. I tooled the leather 6s. The 7s are puzzle pieces. The 8s are vintage shell buttons, antique shell buttons from a factory on the Mississippi River in Muscatine, Iowa. It's no longer there. Sometime during my childhood, someone gave, I don't know who, someone gave my dad a huge, and I mean huge, bag of these antique buttons, which I still have today and I use for very special things. I even have old Victorian shoe buttons that have metal shanks, but these were all shell buttons that I use for the number 8s, and the number 9s are needle felted. While I was working on that, this was on my big loom, and it tied up my big loom for 2.5 years. It was my nemesis. For weavers, it was the Theo Mormon technique, and my tie-down warp was monofilament, which was a horror to work with, I soon found out. This was a love-hate relationship. Anything that could have gone wrong went wrong. For example, I had planned, I purposely left off some of the leaves in the vine coming down the side because I was going to needle felt them. And I had different shades of green fleece, and I started trying to needle felt these leaves, and they were absolutely hideous. So that plan A didn't work. Fortunately, I had remnants of green cloth that I had, different ones that I had woven over the years for Christmas cards, and I had enough to cut out leaf shapes, and they turned out great. So that should have been plan A all along. I will mention that the photograph that you see within the top shelf is my husband and me at the Matterhorn in Switzerland, and I had it printed in sepia tone. And then the little painting, the miniature painting down below it was done by my grandmother. Anyway, so I took this off the loom once I finally got it woven, and it buckled and it crimped and it would not lay flat. So I was horrified at that. I knew I couldn't iron it because I couldn't melt the monofilament. So a friend suggested, actually it was Ann Abendroth who was watching, she suggested I block it. And Ann lent me her blocking boards and at least 500 T-pins. And I pinned every little bit on this piece to make it lay flat. And then I very carefully misted it with distilled water. I got it evenly damp. It was not soaking wet at all, just evenly damp to block it. And the red in the picture on top bled into the background. So that was another horror I had to solve. It was just one thing after another. But I finally got it done. I constructed the flower knots for the little vase on the second from the bottom shelf. And I stitched in titles of some of our favorite authors and books. But the thing that kept me from getting this done was the books themselves. What color were they going to be? Because we have bookshelves all over our house, but the books are loosely organized according to author or maybe subject matter. But these books had no author or subject matter, and I didn't know what color they should be. And that was quite a huge stumbling block. But it's finally hanging in our living room. I do love it now. It will never go to an exhibition because it will be impossible to pack to ship, but there it is, and I do like it now. I had the ultimate mixed media experience when I took NWDC's masterclass in 2020 with John Garrett. Fortunately, we were able to do the class before COVID shut everything down. And this was the class project. John supplied us with wire flower baskets and some small squares of hardware cloth, some of which were painted. And he taught us a lot of interesting techniques, including his stitching techniques, which are the top rim and the bottom of this. Those strips of metal flashing were stitched into hardware cloth. I learned how to use a riveter. I learned how to twist wire using a drill and many other outside of my box techniques. I just loved it. It took me a month to finish this project. And John suggested at one point that pieces like this ought to have some ballast so they don't fall over. So I went to Goodwill and found this glass bowl that I thought was perfect for this particular piece. I call it my sampler, my JG sampler. That led to this piece. I found that I really enjoyed going to Goodwills and salvage stores looking for ingredients, one of which was this frosted glass light cover and another metal basket that was in a salvage store. So I didn't know where this piece was going to go. I had no idea. I started wrapping excess ply splitting cords around the basket. And one day I was streaming online the Decorah Eagles website, which I watch every year. And this particular year, they were raising 3 eaglets. And at one point, one of the adults flew in with a large stick and then spent quite some time trying to get it situated just so in the rim of the nest. And it was fascinating to watch, and that's how I got the idea of a nest. So here's my nest. I needle felted the eggs, and underneath the eggs is a ply split mat of orange and blue. And I think you're all familiar with the phrase, birds of a feather flock together. Well, this is a bird of a different feather, and I consider myself to be a bird of a different feather. So for the most part, I don't flock. And this is another piece, mixed media piece. This one's about 13 inches across. The previous one, about the same, 12 or 13 inches across. And here I ply split conjoined little vessels that are hidden in this bowl. The bowl is paper mache, which I hadn't done since I was a kid, so that was fun relearning that. And I used a couple of crumpled up brown grocery bags for the paper. And because it's COVID, those conjoined little baskets have to be sequestered from the eye candy of the rest of the world. So that was the thought behind this piece. And it was part of the Art in the Time of Corona exhibition, which was produced by Dab Art in Los Angeles. So this took quite a while, but I really enjoyed figuring out what I was going to do. It's another salvaged metal basket, and I was figuring out what I was going to do with each of the circles. One of the, well, for me, I think it's kind of been the ultimate artistic experience in a way, and that's collaboration. I started out collaborating with Alice Schlein, who lives in South Carolina. And Alice is in the stratosphere of American weaving. Every weaver knows her name. She's prolific. She's a genius. I just can't say enough about Alice. And she does a blog, and I was noticing over some time that she started making books and using remnants of her hand-woven cloth for the covers. So I contacted her one day and I said, Alice, how about a ply split band for one of your books? And that's what got us started. So this piece was in a Small Expressions exhibition. This set of two that we did, the books are exactly the same size and made exactly the same way. So my challenge was to make exactly the same bands for them. And Alice made the books and then sent them to me, and I attached the cords, and then I ply split the bands. So for these two, I started out ply splitting maybe half an inch or an inch or so on one, and then I'd switch to the other, and I moved back and forth continuously just to try to get them exactly alike as I possibly could. Here they are. The closures are washers that flip down from the Boeing surplus store right here. And oh, how I miss the Boeing surplus store. Now that I'm doing more mixed media work, it would be a gold mine, but alas, it's no longer there. This piece was part of an exhibition called Firestorm in Colorado Springs, and it commemorated the horrendous fire the previous year that was in that area. So Alice's cloth represents the charred forest, and my ply split band represents the first growth that starts when a forest starts to renew itself, the grasses and the flowers. I became interested in passementery during this time, and I started analyzing woven passementery bands, which were meant for trimmings, and they're very finely woven, often of very fine silk threads. But I found in analyzing how these were woven that, again, I could ply split these. So this band, I analyzed this drawing of a passementery band from 1844. And it was really fun to determine how many cords I needed to do the design. And then on the right-hand side, the closure is a Turk's head knot that I made. So this is refoliation. This collaboration with Lynn Christensen, again, got its seeds in the Manchester conference in 2012, where I met Lynn for the first time. And after several conversations, we found we both had similar approaches to our work, essentially that were unconventional. Lynn is a very experienced braider and develops her own braid structures as well as using uncommon materials for her braids. And in 2018, she contacted me and asked if I would be interested in partnering with her to teach at the Braids 2019 conference in Japan, and to teach a class on creativity and collaboration. Well, of course I would. I wasn't going to turn that down. And so we realized, because we were teaching about collaboration, that we needed to actually collaborate on something. So we decided, after a lot of discussion, to do, our theme would be rain chains. And that was fortuitous for two reasons. One, because rain chains originated in Japan. And two, it naturally divided our areas of expertise. I would ply split the vessels, and Lyd would do the braiding, which would represent the water, which would come down through the vessels and along their sides. So each of my vessels is actually a cylinder. It's open at the top and the bottom, so the braids can come through and down their sides. I also felted pieces to represent stones, because traditionally at the bottom of Japanese rain chains, the water comes down into an area of stones. I thought I was going to needle felt these stones, and soon realized that that would take absolutely forever. So I started cutting up nylons and throwing bunches of fleece into nylons and tying them off and throwing them into the washing machine and into the dryer. And I got these nice pieces that looked like stones. So I started ply splitting before Lynn started braiding. And once I finished a set, I would send them to her so she could design the braids that she wanted to represent the water. Each time I did 3 sets, and each time I completed a set, I sent them to her. She lives in the Boston area. But it did become apparent that we were going to have to actually get together to assemble our chains. And that happened in the July 4th week in 2018. I went to the Boston area to be with Lynn. I stayed with her and her husband, and we worked in her studio. Lynn's studio is she's among a consortium of artists who have studio space in this old textile mill. And it's an old red brick textile mill. It was beastly hot during that week. And of course, that red brick absorbed all of heat. The only air conditioning in the entire building was the little eating area where we could have lunch. So we had fans going, and I don't know how much water we drank because it was so hot, but it was a good week. Initially, I thought, gosh, I'm going to be there a whole week. I mean, what are we going to do for the rest of the time? It's not going to take long to get these together. Well, we used every single minute available to us. And it was really fun. It was a challenge. It was just great fun, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. And that culminated in the installation in Iga, Japan. We were sent early on one photo of a small part of the area where our pieces would hang. And it really didn't give us a good idea of what was going to happen. This building is a historic building. It's a National Historic Site. It was built as a school for samurai children. And our chains were to hang in the kitchen area. And again, we really didn't know what we were facing until we got there, and we found that there were 3 great beams holding up the roof in the kitchen area, and it was absolutely perfect to show for our chains. Again, I was the one up on the ladder. Lynn didn't like ladders, so I was always the one up doing the fine tuning. But it was, we were just thrilled when we found the site itself. Couldn't have been more perfect. And during that day, they provided lunch for us in this building. And they opened the doors to the outside, to the beautiful gardens. And we were just having a great time. Makiko Tada, who took this photo, was one of the chairs of the conference, and she is a world authority on braiding. Probably I would consider the world authority on braiding. And Roderick Owen, who I mentioned earlier, learned from Makiko Tada. So anyway, sandwiches and drinks were provided, and Makiko explained that the drinks were tea-flavored water. So Ed, Lynn's husband, has a very quick wit, and he immediately said, or water-flavored tea. Perfect timing, and everybody burst out laughing, and the Japanese ladies especially. So that was it was a really fun lunch. And this is the final exhibition lighting, and we were thrilled. Lynn had actually rigged up miniature speakers in that center chain, which were remote controlled, and with a recording of rain falling and water trickling. So it was absolutely magical. We were thrilled. So this is my studio. On the left is my small loom, and it's pretty much hidden by the work table. And I've got an inkle loom and a card weaving loom sitting on top of it. It's not in use at the moment that this photo was taken. My big loom here is on the right. It's the loom I prefer. And you can see underneath, those are the treadles that I have to tie up when I do a new design. Here's my takadai on the left. This is another Japanese braiding apparatus. It's kind of a loom in a way. I have to set up all the threads on individual bobbins. I have 73 going for this design. And what happens is my hand moves. For this design, it was under 2, over 2, under 2, over 2, all the way up to the very last thread. And then this piece of wood, it's hanging here now, but it's a slender, thin piece of wood. It goes through that opening I've created, that shed, if you will, with my hands, and it rests underneath this bar and holds the shed open. And then this last thread is cast through the shed and then goes over here to the other side. So that's how the takadai, how you weave on a takadai. And as you can see, you end up creating diagonal lines in the weaving. It's very soothing. You have the gentle clacking noises of the bobbins, as opposed to the clanking noises of the floor loom. On the right is my cord maker, and it consists of a disc which has 4 rotating hooks on it, and it's attached to an electric drill, which is resting in what I call a sled, for want of a better term. To make the cord, I first have to decide how many threads I want per ply. Again, I'm making a 4-ply cord. I decide how many threads I want per ply, and I run them between corresponding hooks on the cord maker and that piece anchored on a door called the out end. So I first set up all those threads, and then I turn the drill on and I hold the disc so the disc won't rotate. The hooks rotate and twist those individual threads together to form a ply. And as this is happening, it shortens the length of the threads, and so the sled moves and brings it shortens the length, and the sled moves and shortens the cord length about 20%. I call this the take up, and I have about a 20% take up usually for my cords. Then I release the disc, I let go of it, and turn the drill on and pull back on the drill a little bit, and the disc will rotate those plies around themselves, and that forms the cord. So that's how I make all of my ply splitting cords. This is my latest piece, recently finished. I call it Oolong. Instead of color here, I wanted to work with texture in my ply splitting. Somebody in NWDC a few years ago, and unfortunately I don't remember who, but whoever it was called my attention to an exhibition called Chigusa and the Art of Tea. And its focal point, its prime item in the exhibition was a historic tea jar from Japan that was ceramic, but it was very rustic looking, and it had a cloth top and decorative cords. So that kind of was my inspiration here, although this looks nothing like that piece. But it gave me the ideas for this piece. And I was working with texture, as I said. Once I finished it, I stained it with tea. All the cords, except all the brownish cords, are natural linen. And then, of course, the blue, those are rayon. But I stained it with tea to kind of get a more rustic look to it. I brewed about 2 cups of tea and put 10 tea bags in it. It was more like sludge. And then I dipped paper towels in it. And then I laid the wet paper towels onto the piece until the towels dried. And I had to do it twice to get enough of a stained look that I wanted. So this is Oolong. So that kind of summarizes my work to this point, how I got to where I am today. I'm still open to learning new things, trying new fiber interlacements, for example. But when I think about that idea of learning something new, I always stop myself and think, okay, might I be able to combine this with something I already do to justify the time I'll spend learning a new technique, or the materials, or possibly even the equipment necessary? So that's kind of my thoughts process, but I'm always open to something new. But I still have my Smokey Bear hat, so you never know. Thank you very much.